Well, I think the single most serious problem is undoubtedly climate change. Today's news of the release of the latest IPCC report confirms that. It really needs urgent action to reduce the causes of global warming and to develop mitigation strategies how to do that. But it would be a mistake if we focused only on climate change. There are other worrying trends that are happening. For example, there is increasing antibiotic resistance. More and more diseases and pests are becoming resistant to antibiotics, and it's a big worry for the whole medical profession. There are new diseases arising. We know of the viruses, the Zika virus, the Ebola virus. These new diseases, they can arise because of the increasing density of the human population and the increasing contact and movement of humans enable diseases to take off where previously they would have died down. There is biodiversity loss, and I don't mean just the loss of iconic species, birds, but the loss of crucial lower levels of biodiversity, pest control agents like spiders and others we're losing huge amounts of biodiversity, and we don't even know. That contributes a lot to the resilience and capacity of natural systems to keep functioning. The loss of crop varieties that we're using because of multinational corporations that develop new varieties of wheat or of rice. They want only that variety to be spread all over. So thousands of varieties of rice have now gone from India, from East Asia, and that was a source of resilience for future changes. So we need to understand the interactive dynamics of how all of these different trends are happening. How does one affect the other? How does climate change influence the disease and vice versa? And so it's vital for all of this, as I've said, is reversing the cause of global warming. And this will require fundamental changes in how we use the resources of the earth. We need to transform the systems we have for agriculture, for water use, for energy production, as well as the economic systems that drive the way we do those resource use systems. They have to be transformed and changed fundamentally, and that's not easy. Because to make that happen, we need to identify and to then understand the critical environmental limits to change. How much can those systems change before they can no longer recover? That's really the definition of resilience. And then we need to learn how we can avoid crossing those limits, those thresholds. And I think, to me, that's the single most important problem, is this interactive dynamics of climate change and these other factors that are happening. And what limits are there to how much change can happen before we can no longer recover? We're getting some indications, but we need much more effort and directed research to identify where those limits are and what drives us towards those limits. Well, again, it isn't one particular environmental problem that they're going to face. They're going to face a number of interacting problems, and it's the combined interacting set of problems. Exploring that challenge means understanding how complex systems work. And complex systems are different to complicated systems. Complicated system, like your watch or something, you can predict what will happen if you change any one part of that system. In a complex system, you can't predict it. There are so many interactions, and if you change one part, and it changes another. That change might be up or down. You can't predict because it depends on the state of that system at the time. So if you make any particular intervention in a complex system, you can't predict what the outcome will be. So understanding the dynamics of complex adaptive systems is a hugely important research area that we have to fully understand. We need to know where and how to intervene in those systems. Agricultural systems, urban systems, even the human body is a complex adaptive system. And if you want to resolve some problem, you have to know where to intervene and how to intervene, what secondary effects might occur. There might be two interventions you need. The intervention might need to be made at a different scale. So we need to understand all that dynamics in order to know how to manage it and how to intervene in it. Again, I think the most important part of being able to do that is actually going to be in the social parts of these complex systems. Changes often are required in governance, into how the system is used, the rules for using the system. Those are often where the most important changes need to be made. It might be okay to make a change in a particular part of the system, but how do you effect that change? And that's often something that's happening in the social part of the system. So the interlinks between the ecological, the biophysical part of the system and the social system, and how that feeds back and forth, is an area that we really don't understand enough. And we need to understand a lot more about social dynamics and how they influence the way in which we use natural systems. So it's understanding the behavior of linked environmental social systems. I think that's where the emphasis needs to be. Well, as I've said, the next generation, first of all, needs to understand how the environment, as an integrated whole, social and environmental parts, is changing. And what is causing those changes? What are the critical levels of change? And that's a difficult challenge. But in terms of what's needed to manage and reverse the changes, it's the relatively easy part. The most difficult thing that must be achieved is overcoming society's resistance to changing how we use the environment. We know some of the ways are wrong, but how do we get society to accept that? So many government and corporate leaders are in what we call a state of denial. They either don't believe the evidence, or they won't commit to the level of change that's necessary. And they want to keep doing it because the immediate costs to them are too high for this. So they deny it. And it is very frustrating to see people still denying the unequivocal evidence of global warming. And yet they will do so because it's in their short-term interests and profit-making capacity to deny it. So how do we overcome that? So what needs us to do that? Well, I expect the next generation to bring about a fundamental change, a transformative change in social norms and ethics in regard to living in and using the environment of this blue planet. Continued growth with its environmental impacts cannot continue. You cannot grow infinitely on a finite planet. Society must no longer admire the very rich. People must no longer strive to be rich in terms of how much money they have. This is based on unjustified consumption of Earth's resources. The new norm that we have to develop has to be a demonstrated, sustainable lifestyle. That's what the new generation has to begin to admire. That's what society as a whole has to develop. And it's the new generation that will have to start making that happen. The Nobel economist Elinor Ostrom, she got the Nobel Prize for her work on small-scale societies that have persisted for a couple of hundred or more years in using resources, like irrigation communities. She's done some wonderful work in Spain and the Philippines on how those societies have continued for hundreds of years, and on fisheries, local-scale fisheries. And for all of those that have managed to persist for a couple or more hundred years, they have developed a set of rules. Ones that didn't have those rules failed. And those rules for persistence all have to do with sustainability. They're based on sharing, and they're based on non-overusing the resources. They have criteria for saying it is dangerous to use more than this. And they collectively agree, because there is a collective set of rules which have evolved and that they use to do that. Not overusing resources is so fundamental. If you look at natural evolved ecosystems, the top predators do not overuse the resource. They only take what they need. I give a kind of facetious comment, if I can, for this, because I worked on savannas and the interaction of wildlife and vegetation in savannas in Africa for a long while. And you cannot imagine a lion pride, which is the top predator, and the dominant male lion says to the pride male next to him, "So how many wildebeest did you guys get last night?" And the guy says, "Oh, we got 5. And this pride male says, "Ha, we got 8. They could no more eat 8 than 5 or 2. They can only eat 1. So you just don't kill 8 or 5. Lions kill and eat only what they need." Today's top predators, corporate leaders, kill and eat as much as they can, because that's what you admire. Wealth far beyond what is necessary and needed for that group or anyone else. Changing norms and ethics is a bottom-up process. You cannot try and change them from the top. It's a bit like the new social norm of non-smoking. Around the world, and in not every part of the world, it began at a local level, where people said, "We don't like that anymore. That's enough of that." And as that spread, it became a norm, and then it became an ethic, and then it became a rule. They didn't make the rule until there was a normative change in behavior. So, it's the next generation that can and that must initiate the necessary changes in normative behavior in society as a whole, and in particular societies that they live, because otherwise all that we know which must be done environmentally will not be done without that normative change. And I believe that's the big task of the next generation, because our generation have failed.